The afternoon sun hung heavy over the suburban neighborhood like a lazy predator, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and obsessively maintained facades. Jennifer Hartley stood at her kitchen window, watching her husband Marcus in the backyard, his hand on the small of another woman's back. Not aggressively, not threatening, just intimate, familiar, the kind of touch that spoke of repetition, of secret conversations whispered in dark bedrooms and stolen moments in parked cars. Jennifer's fingers pressed against the cold glass, so hard her knuckles went white. 14 years. 14 years of mortgages and date nights that became obligation nights, then eventually no nights at all. 14 years of watching him scroll through his phone at dinner, his face illuminated by a glow that didn't come from her. 14 years of asking, "Is everything okay?" and receiving the hollow assurance, "Everything's fine, Jen, just stressed about work." The woman in the yard was younger. Not dramatically so, maybe 32 to Jennifer's 41, but young enough. Young enough that she still had that glow, that confidence that came from believing you would never age, never wilt, never become invisible in your own marriage. She wore white linen pants and a cream-colored blouse, and her laugh carried across the yard like wind chimes. Jennifer recognized that laugh from a phone call 3 months ago, a call that Marcus had taken in the garage, the door clicking shut behind him. That was the moment she knew. Not from any smoking gun, not from finding texts or emails or hotel receipts, just from the sound of his voice changing when he answered. The voice of a different man. The voice of a man she no longer knew, wearing her husband's face. "That's Sandra from the office," Marcus had said when he came back inside, his shirt untucked slightly differently than before. "She stopped by to drop off some files I left at work." The lie wasn't even creative. It was so transparent, so insulting in its laziness, that Jennifer had actually laughed. A hollow, brittle sound that made Marcus look at her strangely, as if she were a stranger in her own kitchen. Now watching them through the glass, Jennifer felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, she was past anger. Anger was a fire that eventually burned itself out. This was something colder, something that pooled in the pit of her stomach like stagnant water, like something dead and rotting just beneath the surface of a beautiful lake. Marcus was explaining something about the pool. He'd been obsessed with the pool for the past 2 months, spending thousands on maintenance, professional cleaning, adding expensive saltwater treatment systems. He'd never cared about the pool before. They'd had it for 8 years and he'd barely swum in it. But suddenly 2 months ago it had become immaculate, a showpiece. Jennifer realized now that it was for Sandra. He wanted Sandra to see how successful he was, how the beautiful home was maintained, how the water would be perfect and cool and inviting on hot summer days. Sandra trailed her fingers along the pool's edge, and Marcus watched her with an expression Jennifer had almost forgotten he was capable of: wonder, appreciation, genuine interest in another human being's thoughts and movements. Jennifer turned away from the window and walked to the refrigerator. She poured herself a glass of white wine, even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. Her hands were still shaking. She drank the wine in 3 long swallows and poured another. By 5 o'clock, Sandra had left and Marcus had showered. He came into the kitchen smelling of cologne, expensive, the kind he usually reserved for business trips, and kissed the top of Jennifer's head. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "You okay, babe?" he asked, opening the refrigerator without waiting for an answer. "You look tired." "I know," Jennifer said quietly. "Hard day." "You could say that." Marcus grabbed a beer and settled onto a stool at the kitchen island. He pulled out his phone immediately, his thumbs flying across the screen. Jennifer watched him from across the counter. This man she'd built a life with, this man she'd forgiven for countless small betrayals and broken promises, this man she'd convinced herself was still the boy she'd married 20 years ago in a chapel with white roses and naive optimism. "I'm filing for divorce," she said. Marcus's thumbs froze mid-scroll. He looked up and for a moment, just a moment, Jennifer saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, fear. The first genuine emotion she'd seen from him in years, then it was gone, replaced by practiced defensiveness. "What, Jennifer, come on, what's this about?" "Sandra," Jennifer said, "from the office." The color drained from Marcus's face. He set the phone down very carefully, as if it might explode if he moved too quickly. "There's nothing." "I know," Jennifer interrupted. "I don't need an explanation. I don't need apologies or promises to change or couples therapy or any of it. I just need you to leave." "This is crazy," Marcus said, but his voice was hollow. He knew it was over. Somewhere inside, he'd known for a while. "You're overreacting. You saw Sandra stop by for a work thing and you—" "Don't," Jennifer held up her hand. "Please don't insult me by lying anymore, not today. I've earned the courtesy of honesty, Marcus, at least now, at the end." He stared at her, and she watched the last threads of their marriage snap audibly in the silent kitchen. He stood up, still holding his beer, and walked to the sliding glass doors that opened onto the backyard. He looked out at the pool, pristine and perfect, its water like polished glass. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "You can't just throw away 14 years because of—" "Because of what?" Jennifer's voice was sharp now, cutting through the careful control she'd maintained. "Because my husband is having an affair. Because he doesn't even have the decency to lie convincingly anymore. Because I came home from my mother's funeral 3 months ago to find my husband completely checked out of our marriage. Because that woman was in our home, in our pool, wearing clothes that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. And you looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered." "You don't know anything," Marcus said, but it was a whisper. "I know everything," Jennifer replied, "and I'm done." She left him standing in the kitchen, staring out at the pool, and went upstairs to the bedroom. She pulled out her laptop and began searching for divorce attorneys. She moved methodically with the kind of cold precision that comes from having already made the hardest decision. The tears would come later, she knew they would. There would be nights when she couldn't breathe, when the weight of 14 years of wasted hope would crush her. But not now. Now she was pure purpose. Now she was a woman who had finally seen the truth and decided to act on it. Marcus left that night without saying goodbye. He went to a hotel downtown, the Marriott, somewhere impersonal and temporary. Jennifer knew this because his location was still linked to her phone's GPS, a habit they'd established years ago for safety, for trust, for a marriage that had been slowly corroding all along. Over the next 3 weeks, Jennifer became someone new. She hired a ruthless divorce attorney named Michelle Chen, who took one look at Marcus's financial records and smiled like a shark who'd spotted blood in the water. Michelle laid out the strategy with military precision. The house would be hers, half of his retirement accounts, alimony until she chose to remarry or became financially independent, and full disclosure of all his affairs, past, present, and future, would be required in the settlement papers. "He's been systematically moving money around," Michelle explained, pushing a spreadsheet across her desk. "Deposits to a separate account, unusual transfers to investment accounts you're not listed on. If we push, I think we can prove financial infidelity. He's been planning this, whether consciously or not." Jennifer felt the cold pool of anger in her stomach begin to heat. Not into rage, something more focused than rage. Calculation. Strategy. The kind of thinking that made her realize she'd been living with a stranger for much longer than 3 months. Marcus, meanwhile, had hired a lawyer of his own, a slicker, more expensive attorney who represented high-net-worth individuals. For 3 weeks, the lawyers went back and forth. Michelle would send proposals. Marcus's attorney would send counterproposals. Each one chipped away at Jennifer's supposed settlement, reducing her claims, introducing complicating factors, hearing forensic accountants to challenge her assertions about the marital assets. It was this process, the coldness of it, the way a marriage could be reduced to line items and negotiating points, that began to break Jennifer. Not the affair, not the betrayal, but the realization that her husband was now actively working to take as much from her as possible. He was fighting her. He was making her fight for the life she'd built. He was acting as though she was the villain. 4 weeks in, Marcus came home to collect some personal items. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and Jennifer had taken the day off work specifically to avoid him. But he came anyway, letting himself in with his key. They hadn't discussed the logistics, and Michelle had advised against changing the locks yet. It could complicate custody of shared assets. Jennifer heard him downstairs, moving through the house like a burglar in his own home. She stood at the top of the stairs, watching him throw clothes into a suitcase, watching him gather his golf clubs from the garage, watching him be incredibly, deliberately casual about the fact that he was dismantling their shared life piece by piece. "Hi," she said from the top of the stairs. He looked up, startled. For a moment, something vulnerable crossed his face, the ghost of the person she'd married, the person who'd once promised to love her forever. Then the mask came back down. "I'm just grabbing some things," he said. "I know. Jennifer, I don't want to fight with you about this. Maybe there's a way we could work things out without. Without what? She interrupted. Without lawyers, without you destroying me financially, without you and Sandra continuing to rub this in my face. That's not fair, Marcus said. And for the record, Sandra has nothing to do with this. Our marriage was already. Don't. Jennifer came down the stairs, step by step, each one feeling like a descent into something darker. Don't rewrite history. Don't pretend you didn't check out. Don't pretend you weren't planning this. Don't pretend that Sandra doesn't exist or that you didn't spend my mother's funeral weekend planning your escape. Marcus's jaw tightened. Your mother died 3 months ago, Jennifer. Maybe if you didn't use that as an excuse for every problem in our marriage. She hit him. She didn't know she was going to do it until her hand was already moving, until her palm connected with his cheek with a crack that echoed through the empty house. The impact stung her hand, and his head snapped back slightly, his expression morphing into shock and anger. Get out, Jennifer said, her voice shaking. Get out of my house. Our house, Marcus corrected coldly, rubbing his cheek. Half of which is legally mine until the settlement is finalized, and you just assaulted me. My lawyer is going to have a field day with that. He left, his suitcase rolling behind him, his golf clubs hefted over his shoulder. Jennifer stood alone in the foyer, her hand still stinging, and felt something inside her fracture. Not break, fracture. The kind of damage that runs deep, that will never fully heal, that will always be visible if you know where to look. That night, she poured a bottle of wine and sat by the pool with a bottle of sleeping pills within reach. Not because she wanted to die, she was too angry to die, too focused on her fury to surrender to despair. But because the pills represented an option, and having options, she discovered, could sometimes be enough to survive the night. By morning, she hadn't taken them. Instead, she'd researched. She'd found Sandra's social media accounts and scrolled through pictures of a woman who looked exactly like what Jennifer expected. Beautiful, unburdened, the kind of woman who posted photos of herself at wine bars and yoga classes and farmers markets. Her captions were aspirational. Living my best life. Gratitude. New beginnings. Jennifer had scrolled through Sandra's photos with the methodical precision of a detective building a profile. She found a picture from Marcus's company retreat taken 6 months ago, before he'd started obsessing over the pool, before Jennifer even knew Sandra existed. In the photo, Marcus was standing next to Sandra, and his hand was on her back. Not aggressively, just intimately. 6 months, not 3. Their marriage had been crumbling for 6 months, and Jennifer had been the only one who didn't know. She closed her laptop at 3 in the morning and made a decision that she would later come to regret. That would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. That would transform everyone involved and reveal truths that were buried deeper than anyone wanted to dig. She went to the storage shed behind the house and found the industrial concrete mixer that Marcus had rented for a project last summer and somehow never returned. She called around to find out if she could rent it again. She made a list of supplies: cement, water, gravel, concrete accelerant. She planned it like a military operation, checking the weather forecast, calculating the time it would take, determining the exact moment when the transformation would be complete. 3 days later, at noon on a Saturday, with Marcus at Sandra's apartment across town, Jennifer started the mixer. The sound of it roared through the quiet neighborhood, a mechanical beast awakening. She'd paid cash for the supplies, worn gloves, and a mask, and told her neighbors she was having some foundation work done. No one questioned it. People never really paid attention to their neighbors, Jennifer had discovered. They only saw what fit their own narratives. She mixed the first batch slowly, methodically. The concrete slid into a wheelbarrow, thick and heavy, the color of gray stone. She wheeled it to the pool's edge and stood there for a moment, really looking at it. This pool had been her sanctuary. She'd swum laps here every morning before work, alone with her thoughts, alone with her body, alone with the woman she thought she was. She'd watched sunsets reflected on the water's surface. She'd imagined conversations with the Marcus she'd married while floating on a raft, staring at stars. All of it was going to end now. All of it was going to become concrete. The first pour was the most satisfying. The thick gray sludge sliding into the pristine water, the surface roiling, the blue disappearing beneath the gray. Jennifer had expected to feel guilty or hesitant or afraid. Instead, she felt powerful. She felt like she was finally doing something instead of having things done to her. Batch after batch, the pool filled. It took longer than she'd anticipated, almost 6 hours of mixing, pouring, spreading, smoothing. By the time she was finished, her back ached and her hands were raw inside the gloves. But the transformation was complete. Where there had been a pool, there was now a rectangular expanse of concrete, smooth and gray and utterly, completely changed. She cleaned up methodically, disposed of the evidence, returned the mixer with cash and a fake name. She was meticulous in a way she'd never been meticulous before. She showered the concrete dust from her hair and skin, changed into fresh clothes, and was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea when Marcus came home, his key turning in the lock at 6 o'clock. She heard his footsteps in the foyer. She heard him calling her name. And then she heard the exact moment he walked into the backyard and saw what she'd done. The sound he made, it was somewhere between a scream and a laugh, a noise of pure, unfiltered shock and disbelief. "Jennifer," his voice came through the sliding glass doors, confused, terrified. "Jennifer, what did you do?" She didn't answer. She just took another sip of her tea and waited. Marcus burst through the sliding glass doors like a man possessed, his face the color of old bone. He stared at the concrete expanse for a full 10 seconds without moving, without breathing, as if his brain couldn't quite process what his eyes were seeing. "What the hell did you do?" His voice was a roar that came from somewhere primal, somewhere that had nothing to do with logic or reason. It was pure animal fury. Jennifer sat on the couch, unmoved, watching him with an expression of profound calm. She'd prepared for this moment over and over during the concrete pouring, running through his potential reactions, readying herself for whatever came next. But now that he was here, now that it was actually happening, she found she felt almost nothing. It was like watching a storm through a window, dramatic but ultimately untouchable. "I poured concrete into your precious pool," she said matter-of-factly. "The one you've been spending so much time on lately." "You're insane," Marcus breathed. "You've literally lost your mind. Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea what this pool is worth, what this is going to cost me in the settlement?" Jennifer smiled, a small, sharp expression that had nothing to do with happiness. "That's what you're worried about? Not that I destroyed something, not that I damaged the house. You're worried about what it costs you." "The house was both of ours," Marcus said, his hands beginning to shake. "That pool was an asset. My lawyer is going to have a field day with this. This is destruction of marital property. This is, Jesus Christ, Jennifer, this is crazy." He pulled out his phone with shaking fingers and began scrolling, clearly dialing his attorney. But before he could hit call, Jennifer spoke again, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "I recorded it," she said. Marcus's thumb froze mid-scroll. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear flicker across his face. Genuine fear, the kind that comes from realizing that control has slipped away, that someone you thought you understood is capable of far more than you imagined. "What?" "I recorded the entire process," Jennifer continued, standing up and walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "Every second of it. I also recorded a video explaining in detail exactly why I did this, why my husband systematically checked out of our marriage, why he spent 6 months, not 3 months, Marcus, 6 months, having an affair with Sandra Whitmore from his office, why he's been systematically moving money around and trying to screw me in this divorce settlement." "That's not relevant to—" "I'm going to post it," Jennifer said, interrupting him. "All of it. On every social media platform, sent to your company's HR department, forwarded to your mother and your father and your sister. I'm going to email it to Sandra's husband, by the way. Yes, she has a husband. Did you know that? Did Sandra happen to mention that she has a spouse she's been cheating on? Did that fact come up during your little rendezvous?" Marcus's face went white. "Sandra's not married." "Married 11 years, Jennifer said, pulling up a browser on her own phone and turning the screen toward him. "Mark Whitmore works in finance, has 2 kids ages 7 and 9. I'm sure he'd be very interested to know about his wife's extracurricular activities. In fact, I think I'll reach out to him myself." "You can't," Marcus began, but his voice was hollow now, devoid of any real authority. He was realizing, with the speed of a man watching a chess game suddenly shift in ways he couldn't control, that Jennifer had already moved 10 steps ahead of him. "I can," Jennifer said, "and I will, unless we come to a very different kind of agreement." "You're blackmailing me," Marcus said flatly. "I'm protecting myself," Jennifer countered. "This house, I keep it entirely, not half, all of it. The pool house will be particularly interesting for the realtor. All proceeds from the sale go to me. You'll transfer $1 million into an account in my name within 30 days. Your retirement accounts, all of them, I get 70%. and you'll take absolutely nothing from this marriage except the clothes you're wearing and a signed admission of infidelity that I can use if I need to." "That's insane," Marcus said. "No court would ever—" "We're not going to court," Jennifer said quietly. "Because if we do, I'm posting the video anyway. I'm going to destroy you, Marcus. I'm going to make sure every employer you ever work for knows about your affair. I'm going to make sure Sandra's husband knows about her infidelity. I'm going to cost you not just this marriage, but your career, your reputation, and your future. Or you can take my deal, sign the papers, and walk away quietly. You can rebuild somewhere else with whoever you want. But you're not going to take another dime from me." Marcus stared at her for a long moment. She watched the calculations happening behind his eyes, the desperate mathematics of a man trying to figure out if his ex-wife was actually serious. Looking at her face, carved from ice, certain and immovable, he clearly decided that she was. "I need to think about this," he said quietly. "You have 48 hours, Jennifer replied. "After that, the video goes live." He left without another word. Jennifer heard his car start in the driveway and pull away, tires squealing slightly as he accelerated down the street. She stood alone in the house that was now entirely, unmistakably hers, and she allowed herself to feel something. Not quite satisfaction. There was too much ugliness in what she'd done for that, but something close to it. A sense of having seized control back, of having made something happen rather than having things happen to her. She was so focused on that feeling, so absorbed in the righteousness of her revenge, that she didn't notice the one crucial detail she'd overlooked. The pool wasn't just a pool. It was built on a concrete foundation that over the years had developed hairline fractures, nothing visible, nothing that a homeowner would notice unless they were looking for it. The concrete she'd poured was acidic, corrosive to old concrete in ways that Jennifer, in her fury and her careful research about how to destroy the pool, hadn't thought to check. She'd been so focused on the symbolism of it, on the poetic justice of turning his sanctuary into his nightmare, that she hadn't considered the physics. For the first 72 hours, nothing happened. The concrete set. It hardened. It looked exactly as Jennifer had intended, a gray scar across the backyard, a permanent monument to her rage and her power. But by the fourth day, small cracks began to appear in the surface. At first, they were hairline fractures, almost imperceptible. By the fifth day, they'd widened into thin crevasses. By the sixth day, chunks of concrete had begun to crumble and fall away, revealing the older concrete beneath, which was itself beginning to crumble. And on the seventh day, while Jennifer was at work, the ground beneath the concrete simply gave way. She got the call from her neighbor at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Mrs. Chen from next door, asking in a panicked voice if Jennifer knew that there was a massive sinkhole appearing in her backyard. Jennifer's heart stopped. She made an excuse at work and drove home at dangerous speeds, breaking several traffic laws in her haste to see what had happened. The backyard was destroyed. Where the pool had been, there was now a crater, not a metaphorical crater, an actual massive hole in the ground, at least 15 feet deep and nearly as wide. The edges crumbled continuously, as if the very earth was eating itself. The foundation beneath the pool, compromised by years of stress and then suddenly subjected to the corrosive properties of the concrete she'd poured, had essentially dissolved. The weight of the concrete had accelerated the process, pressing down on already weak structural integrity until the entire thing had catastrophically failed. Jennifer stood at the edge of the pit, staring down into darkness, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear. Fear would come later. Right now, there was only the cold realization that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She hadn't just destroyed a pool. She'd fundamentally destabilized the structural integrity of the house itself. She called her structural engineer before she called her attorney. He came out within an hour, an older man named Robert who'd done the original inspection when she and Marcus had bought the house 14 years ago. He stood at the edge of the crater with his hands on his hips, and she heard him sigh, a sound of recognition and disappointment. "This is bad," he said finally. "How bad?" Jennifer asked, though she already knew the answer. "The foundation of the house is compromised," Robert said. "Possibly catastrophically. I'll need to do a full inspection, but from what I can see, the concrete pour into the pool accelerated decay in the support structure that was already fragile. The acidic properties of the concrete you used, this is the problem. It's eaten through the old concrete, which is why the sinkhole is so severe." "Can it be fixed?" Jennifer heard herself ask. "Maybe," Robert said, "but it's going to be expensive. We're talking potentially $100,000, maybe more. You're going to need to shore up the foundation, pour new concrete, potentially rebuild parts of the structure. And in the meantime, you can't live in this house. It's not safe. Whole sections of it could collapse if the foundation continues to deteriorate. Jennifer felt the ground beneath her feet suddenly unstable, which was ironic given that the actual ground beneath her feet was literally unstable. She thought about calling Marcus. She thought about calling her lawyer. Instead, she found herself sitting on the edge of the crater, her feet dangling over the abyss, and she began to laugh. A slightly hysterical sound that started as a chuckle and escalated into something bordering on uncontrolled. Her lawyer, Michelle Chen, arrived an hour later after Jennifer had called her in a panic. Michelle took one look at the sinkhole and immediately understood the catastrophe that had just unfolded. Not just for Jennifer, though the house that Jennifer had fought so hard to keep was now essentially uninhabitable and in need of massive repairs, but for her entire strategy. "This changes everything," Michelle said quietly, standing next to Jennifer at the crater's edge. "I know," Jennifer whispered. "Marcus is going to argue that you destroyed the house deliberately," Michelle continued. "He's going to argue that you destroyed the marital asset with intent. He's going to use this against you. And Jennifer, he's not entirely wrong." "What are you saying?" Jennifer asked, though again she already knew. "I'm saying that your leverage just evaporated," Michelle said. "The video you made proving his affair, that's now evidence of you planning to destroy the house. The concrete you poured that's eating through the foundation, that's now evidence of premeditation and malice. The threat you made to post his infidelity, that could now be used against you as extortion." Jennifer sat down very carefully on the ground, as far from the crater edge as possible. She felt, quite literally, like she was falling. "What do I do?" she asked. Michelle was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said finally, "that you're going to have to tell Marcus what happened, and I think that he's going to have leverage over you now that he didn't have before." By that evening, Jennifer had called Marcus. He'd come to the house, to see the destruction, to understand the magnitude of what had happened. And his reaction had been a complex mixture of shock, fury, and something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Jesus Christ," he'd whispered, looking down into the pit. And then, when he looked back at Jennifer, there was something cold and calculating in his eyes that she'd never seen there before. "My lawyer is going to love this." The settlement took 2 weeks to finalize, but when it was over, Jennifer barely recognized the terms. Her demand for the house had become impossible. The house was now a liability, a potential lawsuit waiting to happen. To even sell it, she'd need to disclose the structural damage, which meant the value would plummet. The repairs alone would bankrupt her. Michelle had advised immediate sale for whatever she could get, but even that was complicated by the fact that Marcus's insurance company was already threatening to deny claims because of deliberate destruction of property. In the end, they sold it to an investor who specialized in fixer-uppers, for 40% less than its value 6 months ago. The proceeds were split equally, leaving Jennifer with barely enough to cover 3 months of rent on a small apartment and to pay Michelle's legal fees, which had skyrocketed once the lawsuit from the property damage had emerged. Marcus, meanwhile, had walked away nearly clean. He'd covered the cost of the foundation damage from his insurance policy, which, as it turned out, technically did cover the damage, though with a high deductible that he was obligated to pay. His separate bank accounts, his carefully hidden assets, his retirement funds, all of it remained substantially intact. He'd paid her alimony for exactly 2 months before moving to California with Sandra, and then he'd technically violated the settlement by failing to continue payments. But by that point, Jennifer was too exhausted and too financially depleted to pursue him. Sandra's husband, Mark, had seen the video that Jennifer had posted anyway. She'd sent it to him in an email the day after she'd confronted Marcus, and the resulting divorce had been equally contentious. Sandra had walked away with far less than she'd anticipated, and she'd left her marriage with a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. In a strange twist of karma, she and Marcus had broken up 3 months after moving to California when he'd begun suspecting her of infidelity with her new yoga instructor. Jennifer had read about it on social media with a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Jennifer was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a part of town she didn't recognize, working 2 jobs to pay her rent, and slowly realizing that the revenge she'd felt so justified in pursuing had left her in a worse position than she'd been in before. The depression that came with this realization was profound and all-consuming. She destroyed her life to punish her husband for destroying her life. It was a perfect circle of destruction, a snake eating its own tail, round and round, getting nowhere. 3 months after she moved into the apartment, Jennifer found herself sitting on her bed at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but exist in the crushing weight of her own choices. She thought about the moment she'd decided to pour concrete into the pool. She thought about how certain she'd been that it was the right thing to do, how righteous her anger had felt, how justified the destruction had seemed. She thought about how wrong she'd been about nearly everything. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again, and again. Finally, at 3:47 a.m., she looked at it. Multiple missed calls from an unknown number, a voicemail notification. She listened to the voicemail with heavy dread, already knowing that nothing good ever came from calls at 3 in the morning. "Ms. Hartley," a female voice said, professional and clipped. "This is Detective Sharon Mills with the police department. We need you to come in for questioning regarding the death of Marcus Hartley. He was found deceased in his apartment in Pasadena, California, approximately 6 hours ago. We'd like to speak with you about your recent communications with him and understand the nature of your relationship at the time of his death. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." Jennifer listened to the voicemail 3 times, and each time it sounded less real, as if she was listening to it from underwater. Marcus was dead. Her ex-husband, the man she'd hated, the man she'd sabotaged, the man who destroyed her marriage and her stability and her sense of self, was dead. She called the detective back immediately, panic overriding her shock. Detective Mills explained that Marcus had been found in his apartment by a neighbor who'd noticed a smell. He'd been dead for approximately 3 days. The preliminary cause of death appeared to be a drug overdose, but they were waiting on the toxicology report. Given some recent communications between Marcus and Jennifer, they wanted to understand the timeline and the nature of their final interactions. "We're not suggesting you had anything to do with this," Detective Mills said carefully. "But we do need to know if there were any threats made, if there was any discussion of self-harm, if you had reason to believe he was suicidal." Jennifer's mind reeled. No, I mean he was always a little dramatic, but I never thought he would. I didn't think he was suicidal. He was excited about his life. He had a new girlfriend, he was starting a new job, The new girlfriend has since left the state," Detective Mills said. "We're attempting to locate her for questioning, but from what we understand, the relationship had deteriorated in recent months. The job situation was also less stable than he'd led you to believe. He'd been laid off from his California position 2 months ago. No income in recent months, bills mounting, facing financial hardship." After they'd hung up, Jennifer sat very still on her bed. The television played silently in the corner. The apartment was cold despite the warm Lowe's Angel's Spring. And Jennifer had a very clear thought: this is my fault. She hadn't given Marcus the drug that killed him. She hadn't been anywhere near him. She hadn't forced him into the pit of despair and financial ruin that had apparently seemed so endless that he'd decided to end his life. But she also recognized, with the clarity of hindsight, that she'd been the first domino. She'd triggered the sequence of events: the affair with Sandra becoming public, the divorce, the financial settlements, the humiliation. She'd been the catalyst that had set everything in motion. Without her rage and her revenge, would Marcus be alive? She would never know, but she would spend the rest of her life wondering. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The detective confirmed that Marcus's death was ruled a suicide, an overdose of heroin and fentanyl, a combination that left no doubt about the intention. There was a note, the detective said, but she wouldn't tell Jennifer what it said. Jennifer assumed it had blamed her in some way. She assumed it had explained that losing everything had become too much. She went to the funeral even though she didn't want to. Marcus's family was there, his mother and father, both looking decades older than they had at the wedding 14 years ago, looking like people whose youngest son had just died and who had no framework for understanding why. His sister was there with her family, and their eyes, when they landed on Jennifer, were full of barely contained accusation. She didn't blame them. She would have blamed herself too. Sandra was there, standing in the back of the small chapel with a new man, not the yoga instructor from California, someone else. She wore sunglasses despite it being indoors, and she left immediately after the service without speaking to anyone. It was Marcus's father who approached Jennifer as she was leaving. He was a tall man, now bent with grief, his face weathered with the kind of pain that doesn't forgive. "I know my son wasn't perfect," he said quietly. "I know he made mistakes, but he was a good boy, Jennifer. He was a good boy who made bad choices, and I wonder sometimes if you wonder what might have been different if you just let him go without destroying everything first." Jennifer didn't have an answer for him. She left the funeral and drove back to her small apartment and sat in the dark and allowed the full weight of her choices to crush her. 6 months after Marcus's death, Jennifer received a certified letter from a law firm in California. She recognized the name of the firm. It was the same firm that had represented Marcus during the divorce. But the letter wasn't from Marcus. It was from his parents. They were suing her for wrongful death. The argument was complex but essentially boiled down to this: Jennifer's deliberate destruction of the pool and the resulting structural damage to the house, combined with her threat to destroy Marcus's reputation, had caused him severe emotional distress. The lawsuit argued that her actions had contributed to his financial ruin, his emotional collapse, and ultimately his decision to end his life. The lawsuit argued that she was, in essence, a murderer. Jennifer read the letter sitting in her car in a parking lot, and she threw up into the bushes beside the vehicle. When she called Michelle Chen, her lawyer told her something she'd been dreading. "They might actually have a case," Michelle said quietly. Over the next year, the lawsuit proceeded through the California court system. The case attracted media attention. "Scorned wife's pool revenge leads to ex-husband's death," one headline screamed. Another: "Revenge gone wrong, woman faces wrongful death suit after covering pool in concrete." A third: "The pool that destroyed everything." Jennifer became infamous, not in the way she'd intended to make Marcus infamous, but in a way that painted her as the architect of his destruction. Social media exploded with theories about her rage, her malice, her intent to harm. People who'd never met her decided that she was a villain. Women who'd been in similar situations watched and worried that society would believe them capable of the same darkness. The trial lasted 3 months. The prosecution, or rather Marcus's family's legal team, presented a carefully constructed narrative. Jennifer as a woman scorned, driven to madness by infidelity, willing to destroy everything to hurt her husband. They presented the video she'd made explaining her intent to ruin him. They presented her communications with Marcus threatening to expose his affair. They presented the destruction of the pool not as a momentary lapse in judgment, but as premeditated malice. Michelle mounted a defense that was technically solid but morally weak. Jennifer had a right to be angry, a right to take actions on her own property, a right to use information as leverage in a divorce settlement. None of that, technically, had led to Marcus's death. His death was his choice. It was his responsibility. But the jury didn't care about technical responsibility. The jury cared about narrative. The jury cared about the story of a woman who'd systematically destroyed a man's life and then acted shocked when he decided he couldn't live with the consequences. The verdict, when it came, was not guilty of wrongful death, but guilty of negligent infliction of emotional distress, and guilty of intentional infliction of emotional distress through the threat of public humiliation. Jennifer was ordered to pay Marcus's estate $250,000. She didn't have it. She'd spent the previous year in debt, paying legal fees and living expenses. She'd managed to save nothing. Michelle helped her set up a payment plan, $500 a month for the next 43 years, which meant that Jennifer would be making payments to the parents of her dead ex-husband for the majority of her remaining life. After the trial, Jennifer gave an interview to a journalist named David Chen, who'd been covering the case. She sat in a coffee shop near her apartment and told him, for the first time, the full story. Not the public version, not the story of a woman enraged by infidelity and seeking justified revenge, but the real story. The story of a woman who'd slowly erased and been erased by her marriage until she didn't know who she was anymore. The story of a woman who'd chosen destruction when she should have chosen healing. The story of a woman who'd succeeded in hurting someone and then had to live with the knowledge that she'd hurt them so badly that they'd decided death was preferable. David's article was published in a national magazine. It went viral. It became a case study in how revenge destroys the person seeking it more thoroughly than it ever destroys the person who's wronged them. It became a cautionary tale. It also became Jennifer's redemption in a way, not because it erased what she'd done, nothing could do that, but because it forced people to see her not as a villain but as a person who'd made terrible choices, A person who'd been in pain and had hurt others because of it. A person who'd have to live with the consequences of her rage for the rest of her life. 2 years after the trial ended, Jennifer was working as a counselor at a women's shelter. She didn't have the formal qualifications, but she'd pursued it through volunteer work and adult education courses, and the shelter had hired her based on her experience and her willingness to do the work. She worked with women who were in situations similar to the one she'd been in, women in failed marriages, women who'd been betrayed, women who were angry and hurt and desperate for a way to make their pain matter. Jennifer would sit with them and tell them her story. Not all of it. She would never tell anyone the full scope of her destruction. But enough. Enough so that they could understand that rage is seductive, that revenge feels righteous, and that both will destroy you if you let them. It was during this period that Jennifer received an unexpected visitor at the shelter. She was walking down the hallway, carrying files for intake appointments, when she saw a woman sitting in one of the waiting areas. The woman was thin, exhausted, her eyes bearing the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been through a war with another person and couldn't quite believe it had happened. It took Jennifer a moment to recognize her. It was Sandra. "I didn't know where else to go," Sandra said without preamble when Jennifer sat down across from her. "I saw your article, I read about what you did, what happened to Marcus, and I realized that I did the same thing you did. I destroyed someone, and then I realized that he destroyed me." Jennifer listened as Sandra explained what had happened after California, how her second marriage, the one she'd started with her yoga instructor, had fallen apart when he'd cheated on her, how she'd spiraled into depression and substance abuse, how she'd attempted suicide twice, how she'd finally gotten sober and gotten therapy and started trying to piece her life back together. "I came here to tell you that I'm sorry," Sandra said. "I'm sorry for what I did with Marcus. I'm sorry for playing a part in your pain. And I came here to ask if you could forgive me, knowing that my role in all of this contributed to where we both ended up." Jennifer thought about this for a long moment. She thought about whether forgiveness was actually possible. She thought about whether Sandra's pain somehow balanced out Jennifer's own pain, or whether pain wasn't a zero-sum game where someone had to win and someone had to lose. "I already forgave you," Jennifer said finally. "Not because what you did was okay, but because I realized that you were as lost and confused as I was. We both made terrible choices. We both hurt people. We both have to live with that, but I can't hate you anymore, not without hating myself. And I've spent enough energy hating myself. I think there's more to do with my life than that." Sandra cried then, and Jennifer, almost without thinking about it, reached across the table and took her hand. They sat like that for several minutes, two women who'd been instrumental in destroying each other's lives, now united in the recognition that destruction begets destruction, and that the only way out was to stop participating in the cycle. Jennifer hired Sandra for a part-time position at the shelter, despite the complications. They never became friends exactly, but they became colleagues who understood each other in a way that few people could. Sandra worked primarily with women who'd had affairs, who understood the guilt and the self-sabotage that came with infidelity. Jennifer worked with women who'd been betrayed. Between the two of them, they provided something unique, the knowledge that both sides of betrayal were devastating, that there were no good guys and bad guys. There were just people who'd been hurt enough to hurt others, and the only way forward was to stop. 5 years after Jennifer had poured concrete into the pool, she stood in front of a classroom full of college students at a university in Northern California. She'd been invited to speak as part of a women's studies course that focused on justice, revenge, and reconciliation. The professor had introduced her as Jennifer Hartley, whose case transformed how we think about the consequences of revenge. Jennifer had asked the professor not to use that introduction. She'd asked to be introduced simply as Jennifer, but the professor had insisted. Jennifer understood why. Titles and names and narratives mattered. They shaped how people understood her. She began her talk not with the concrete or the pool, but with something earlier. She began with the moment she'd realized her marriage was over. She described the feeling of being invisible in her own life, of watching her husband become someone she didn't recognize, of having the ground beneath her shift without warning. "Betrayal is a unique kind of violence," she told the students, "because the person delivering it is someone who's supposed to be protecting you, someone you've trusted completely, and when that trust is broken, the natural response is to want to break them back, to make them feel what you're feeling, to ensure that their pain matches your own." She paused and looked at the faces watching her. Some sympathetic, some judgmental, all of them engaged. I spent a day pouring concrete into a pool, she continued. I did it because I was furious, because I wanted my husband to understand the magnitude of what he destroyed. But here's what I didn't understand. He didn't understand. He didn't have some sudden moment of clarity where he realized how much pain he'd caused me. He had a moment of fury and fear and a need to respond to what he perceived as an attack. And then he had a cascade of consequences that I'd set in motion without fully understanding what I was doing. She told them about the sinkhole, about the house becoming uninhabitable, about how her attempt to destroy her husband's sanctuary had ended up destroying her own. The worst part, she said, is that my husband didn't recover from this. He spiraled. He used drugs to manage the emotional pain of everything that happened, and eventually he decided that the pain was too much to bear. She paused and looked directly at the students. I didn't kill my husband, she said, but I contributed to the circumstances that led him to decide that death was preferable to living. And I've spent the last 5 years understanding that distinction, and understanding that it doesn't matter whether I was the direct cause or an indirect one. I was still part of the chain of events that led to his death. A student raised her hand. Do you think he would have been fine if you hadn't poured concrete in the pool? I don't know, Jennifer said, but I know that he never would have gone through the emotional trauma of the lawsuit, the humiliation of his affair becoming public, the financial ruin. Those things might have happened eventually anyway. People sometimes spiral on their own, but I accelerated it. I ensured it. I made certain that he would never recover from the damage I'd done. Another student, a young man sitting in the back row, asked, do you think he deserved it? Jennifer took a long time answering this question, because she'd asked it of herself thousands of times over 5 years. I think he made terrible choices, she said finally. I think he hurt me in ways that took years to recover from. I think his infidelity was a betrayal that was real and valid and worthy of anger. But no, I don't think he deserved what I did. No one deserves to have their life dismantled systematically by someone who's supposed to love them. Even people who have hurt us don't deserve that. But he hurt you, the young man said. Yes, Jennifer agreed. He did, and I hurt him back. And then other people were hurt as a result of my hurt. His parents were hurt. His new girlfriend was hurt. The people I worked with who lost their jobs because of the consequences of my actions were hurt. And I was hurt most of all because I had to live with the knowledge of what I'd done. After the lecture, 3 students came up to talk to her individually. One was a woman whose father had left her family for another woman. Another was a woman whose wife had cheated on her. A third was a woman whose husband had been systematically emotionally abusive. Jennifer spoke with each of them for as long as they needed to talk. She told them about the counseling she'd pursued. She gave them resources for therapy, for support groups, for ways to process their anger that didn't involve destruction. She told them that healing was possible, but only if they chose it. And that choosing healing meant, sometimes, forgiving the person who'd hurt them, not because what they'd done was okay, but because holding onto rage was a form of slow poisoning. That night in her hotel room, Jennifer received a call from her therapist. They'd been working together for 5 years, since just after the trial ended. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Liu, had been instrumental in helping Jennifer understand the cascade of poor decisions that had led to her current life. How did the lecture go? Dr. Liu asked. It went well, I think, Jennifer said, though I'm not sure anymore if I'm helping people or just serving as a cautionary tale. Does it matter? Dr. Liu asked. Jennifer considered this. I guess if I can prevent one person from doing what I did, then it matters. If I can help one person understand that revenge isn't justice, that it's just another form of pain, then maybe all of this suffering means something. Has this been your journey? Dr. Liu asked gently, finding meaning in your suffering. I don't know, Jennifer said. I've been trying, but sometimes it feels like no amount of meaning would justify what I did, like no amount of helping other people would balance the scales. The scales were never balanced, Dr. Liu said. The world doesn't work on a balance. Suffering isn't a currency that can be exchanged. You can't pay off your guilt by doing enough good works. But you can learn from what you've done. You can choose differently in the future. And you can help others make better choices than you did. That's not about balancing the scales. That's about participating in your own healing. After they hung up, Jennifer sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked at her reflection in the mirror. She was 46 years old now. She looked older, There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, gray in her hair that she'd stopped trying to dye. But she also looked like someone who'd survived something. She thought about Marcus. She tried, as she often did, to imagine what he would be doing now if he were alive, if he'd gotten sober, if he'd found love with someone who wasn't Sandra, if he'd built a life that mattered to him. She tried not to think about the fact that none of those things were possible because of the choices she'd made. The next morning, Jennifer received an email from Marcus's mother, Patricia. The email was forwarded from the shelter, where Patricia had apparently tried to contact Jennifer. It was brief. I read about your lecture. I've been following your work at the shelter. I want you to know that while I still grieve my son, I've come to understand that you were also destroyed by the choices that were made. I don't forgive you for what you did to the pool or what you did to my son. But I understand now that you were acting from a place of pain, not malice. I've started volunteering with an organization that supports families dealing with suicide. I thought you should know that. I thought you should know that your work is making a difference. I thought you should know that not all of my family holds you entirely responsible. Some of us are learning to hold all of it, the pain, the anger, the forgiveness, at the same time. Jennifer read the email 3 times. She cried. She sat in her hotel room and cried for the first time in months, and when she was done crying, she called the shelter and asked for the contact information of the suicide prevention organization that Patricia had mentioned. That afternoon, she scheduled a meeting with the organization's director. By the end of the week, she'd volunteered to develop a program for people who'd lost loved ones to suicide as a result of the actions of others, to help them navigate the complicated terrain of grief, anger, and the desire for justice or revenge. It seemed somehow like a beginning. 10 years after Jennifer poured concrete into the pool, she sat in the modest office of a nonprofit organization called Second Chances, a forum for healing. The office was warm and filled with plants, with photos on the walls of people, faces of those who'd lost someone to suicide, faces of those who'd committed acts of destruction and were learning to live with themselves, faces of counselors and volunteers, and the various people involved in the long, difficult work of reconciliation and healing. Jennifer had founded the organization 5 years ago. It had grown beyond what she'd ever anticipated. They now operated in 12 states, served over 1,000 people annually, and had become recognized as a leader in post-revenge reconciliation work, a field that hadn't really existed before Jennifer had named her own pain and tried to help others name theirs. She was no longer paying off her debt to Marcus's estate. She'd paid it off 2 years ago, the final payment of $500 going to Patricia, who'd used the money to establish a scholarship in Marcus's name. The scholarship went to students who were struggling with mental health issues and couldn't otherwise afford therapy or counseling. Jennifer's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sandra, who was now married to someone she'd met in a support group, a kind, gentle man named Thomas who understood both her capacity for destruction and her capacity for healing. Sandra and Thomas had a 3-year-old daughter and another baby on the way. Sandra had asked Jennifer to be godmother to her first child. Jennifer had agreed, surprising herself with the decision. But then she'd realized that she understood what it meant to trust someone who'd hurt you. And more than that, she understood what it meant to do the work necessary to become trustworthy again. The text from Sandra read, "How's the memoir coming? Thomas says I should stop asking, but I'm excited. You're going to change how people think about revenge." Jennifer smiled and set the phone down. The memoir was nearly complete. It was perhaps the hardest thing she'd ever written, not because the words were difficult, but because she'd had to be honest in a way that was almost impossible. She couldn't hide behind narrative. She couldn't present herself as anything other than a woman who'd made a terrible choice and had spent a decade trying to understand it and repair the damage. There was a knock on her office door. It was Marcus's father, David. He'd become something like a friend over the past decade, or at least a shared survivor in Jennifer's life. He'd divorced Patricia 5 years ago, not because he blamed her for anything related to Jennifer, but because they'd simply grown apart. He'd since become an advocate for suicide prevention himself, and he and Jennifer often collaborated on projects. "I wanted to give you these before you left," David said, handing Jennifer an envelope. "I found them while cleaning out the house. I thought you should have them." Jennifer opened the envelope carefully. Inside were photographs. She recognized them immediately. They were from her and Marcus's wedding, 14 years before the concrete, before the pool, before everything fell apart. In the photos, they were young and laughing and entirely convinced that their love would be enough to sustain them forever. Jennifer had a flower crown in her hair and was looking at Marcus with an expression of pure adoration. Marcus was looking at her the same way, his hand on her waist, his smile genuine and unself-conscious. "I wanted you to remember him like this," David said gently. "Not as the man he became at the end, but as the boy who loved you. I think it's important that you remember that part of him still existed, even when everything else was falling apart." Jennifer looked at the photos and felt something shift inside her, not quite forgiveness, but something close to it, something like acceptance. The acceptance that people were complicated, that her husband had been both the man in the photographs and the man who'd had an affair, that she had been both the woman in the photographs and the woman who'd poured concrete into a pool, that neither version of them was the complete truth, but together they told a story. "Thank you," Jennifer said quietly. After David left, Jennifer placed the photographs in a frame on her office wall, next to all the other faces. The survivors, the healers, the people who'd been changed by their own choices and were learning to live with the consequences. She thought about writing a final section for her memoir. A section that would wrap everything up, that would provide closure, that would tell the reader that she'd learned her lesson and moved on, and everything was better now. But she decided against it, because the truth was that she hadn't moved on. She would never move on from what had happened. What she'd done was not something you moved past or recovered from. It was something you integrated into who you were. It was something that changed you fundamentally and permanently and made you, paradoxically, capable of helping others who'd made similar choices. Jennifer's last appointment of the day was with a new client, a woman named Rachel who just entered their program. Rachel had destroyed her ex-partner's business, a deliberate act of sabotage that had led to her ex-partner's financial ruin. Rachel was now dealing with the guilt and the complexity of having acted from rage and having to live with the real-world consequences of that rage. Jennifer sat across from Rachel and saw her own younger self. She saw the confusion, the need for justification, the desperate hope that someone would tell her that what she'd done was reasonable. Instead, Jennifer told her the truth. She told her the story, not the polished version that was becoming a cultural moment, but the real version. The version with all the pain and the regret and the permanent damage. She told Rachel that the only way forward was to accept responsibility without using that responsibility as a form of additional punishment. To understand what had driven her to such destructive action without using that understanding as an excuse. "It's going to take a long time," Jennifer told her. "And some days you're going to feel like you've moved forward, and then you're going to have a day where the weight of what you've done crushes you all over again. But if you keep showing up, if you keep doing the work, eventually you'll be able to live with what you've done instead of being consumed by it." "Does it get easier?" Rachel asked. Jennifer thought about this carefully. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't get easier, but you get stronger, and sometimes strength is the same as healing." That evening, Jennifer drove to the cemetery where Marcus was buried. She went every month, sometimes more often if she was struggling with something. She didn't talk to him out loud anymore, but she sometimes sat by his grave and thought about who he'd been, who he'd become, who he might have been if everything had been different. She sat down on the ground in front of his headstone and thought about the pool. She thought about how a swimming pool, a luxury item, a symbol of leisure and status and the comfortable life they'd built together, had become the vessel for her revenge. How she'd poured her rage into concrete and watched it destroy everything. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, speaking to the grave, speaking to the memory, speaking to the ghost of the man she'd loved and hurt and helped destroy. "I know that doesn't mean anything. I know you can't hear me or forgive me or tell me that it's okay. But I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry for not choosing differently. I'm sorry that I couldn't forgive you and move on. I'm sorry that my rage mattered more to me than your life." She sat there for a long time, until the sun began to set and the cemetery grew quiet and peaceful. And as she sat there, Jennifer made peace with the fact that she would never fully understand why she'd made the choices she'd made. She would never fully understand how a moment of rage could cascade into a decade of consequences. She would never fully understand the mathematics of how one person's pain could become another person's death. But she could understand that these things happened. She could understand that people were capable of destruction. She could understand that redemption, if such a thing existed at all, wasn't about erasing what you'd done, but about being changed by it, about using that change to prevent others from making the same mistakes, about accepting that you would carry this weight for the rest of your life, and that was exactly as it should be. Jennifer drove home as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. She thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, angry, righteous, convinced that she'd found justice in destruction. She thought about the woman she was now, still carrying that anger, but transformed by time and pain and the slow, difficult work of understanding. She thought about the pool, about how it had been filled with water and then with concrete, and then had collapsed into a sinkhole that had destroyed the house. She thought about how that sinkhole had become a metaphor for her life, for the way destruction spirals and spreads, for the way one choice can fundamentally alter the trajectory of multiple lives. And she thought about healing, real, difficult, imperfect healing. The kind of healing that doesn't make you innocent again, but makes you honest. The kind of healing that doesn't erase your past, but integrates it into who you are. The kind of healing that allows you to help others without losing sight of what you've done, without forgetting the weight of your own choices. As Jennifer pulled into her driveway, she saw the lights of her home, small, modest, filled with the warmth of a life that she'd rebuilt from the wreckage of her own destruction. She saw the photos on her walls, the testimonies of people she'd helped, the evidence of the work she'd done to transform her pain into purpose. She got out of the car and stood for a moment in the cool evening air. Tomorrow, she would speak to a new group of people dealing with revenge and its aftermath. She would work with her team to develop new programs, to reach more people, to help more survivors navigate the complicated landscape of anger and forgiveness and the long road back to wholeness. But tonight, she simply stood in her driveway and allowed herself to breathe, to exist, to be both the woman who'd poured concrete and the woman who'd spent 10 years trying to repair the damage, to be both the destroyer and the healer, to be both broken and whole. And she realized in that moment that perhaps that was the only kind of wholeness that was possible, the integration of your worst self and your best self, the acceptance that you contained multitudes, that you were capable of both destruction and creation, that the only thing that mattered was which version of yourself you kept choosing to become. The sun set fully, and Jennifer went inside her home, and the long work of healing continued, one day at a time, one person at a time, one choice at a time. 6 months after Jennifer's meditation at Marcus's grave, the memoir was published. It became an unexpected bestseller, not because it was sensational or offered easy answers, but because it was brutally honest. Jennifer gave interviews. She appeared on podcasts. She became, in the strange alchemy of modern media, a kind of accidental celebrity of shame and redemption. But she was careful to avoid the trap of redemption narratives. She was careful to explain that she hadn't learned her lesson and moved on. She was careful to emphasize that the consequences of her actions had been permanent, that Marcus was still dead, that the damage she'd caused would ripple outward for generations. In one interview that became particularly viral, a journalist asked her, "If you could go back and do it differently, would you?" Jennifer thought about this for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "but not because of what happened to me, not because of the lawsuit or the debt or the destruction of the house. If I could go back and do it differently, it would be because of Marcus, because he was a person and his death mattered and I had a role in creating the circumstances that led to it. That's the real consequence. That's what I have to live with, not my suffering, but his." The interviewer leaned forward. "Do you think you deserved what happened to you?" And Jennifer, in a moment of perfect clarity, said something that would end up being quoted in articles and academic papers for years to come. "I don't think anyone deserves suffering. Not my husband for his infidelity. Not me for my revenge. Not his parents for losing their son. Not Sandra for her role in the affair. Not me now for the consequences of my actions. We don't deserve suffering, but we cause it anyway. And then we have to figure out how to live with that knowledge. That's not justice, that's just life." Years later, when people asked Jennifer what she thought would have happened if she'd chosen differently, if she'd gotten a divorce quietly, if she'd moved on without revenge, if she'd let Marcus live his life without her interference, she would answer honestly, "I don't know. Maybe he would have gotten clean. Maybe he would have built a good life with someone else. Maybe he would have been happy, or maybe he would have spiraled into depression and addiction anyway and died anyway. I'll never know." And that uncertainty is something I have to carry with me forever. But the most important question, the one that Jennifer asked herself every single day, was not about what might have been, but about who she was choosing to become. Every morning, she woke up and looked in the mirror and saw two women looking back at her, the woman who'd destroyed and the woman who'd healed. She couldn't erase one to become only the other. They would both always exist inside her. What she could do was choose, every single day, which version would guide her actions. And that choice, not the grand gesture of revenge, but the quiet daily choice to be better, to do better, to help rather than destroy, became the real story. Not the dramatic moment of concrete pouring into water, not the shock of the sinkhole, not the tragedy of Marcus's death, but the slow, difficult work of reconstruction, the boring, unglamorous work of healing. And in the end, that turned out to be the most powerful story of all. Jennifer stood in front of a classroom of law students at a prestigious university. She was there to talk about torts, about liability, about the complex legal questions around whether someone can be held responsible for another person's suicide. The students listened intently as she explained the nuances, the gray areas, the way the law struggled to capture the complexity of human suffering. But what they really wanted to know was about the pool. What they really wanted to know was about the moment of rage and what it had cost her. Revenge isn't justice, Jennifer told them. Justice is a legal concept. Revenge is personal. And when you confuse the two, when you believe that your rage has the authority of justice behind it, that's when you create real harm. That's when you start a chain reaction that you can't control. She paused and looked at their young faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all of them certain that they would never make the mistake she'd made. The real question, she continued, isn't whether I was justified in my rage. I was justified. My husband betrayed me. He humiliated me. He lied to me. But the question is whether being justified is the same as being right. And the answer is no. You can be justified and still be wrong. After the class, a young woman approached her in the hallway. She was a second-year student named Maya, and she looked troubled. I appreciate what you said in there, Maya told Jennifer. Because I was planning something similar. My boyfriend cheated on me and I was going to destroy his car. It was going to be my way of making him understand what he'd done to me. Jennifer looked at this young woman, so angry, so hurt, so certain that destruction was justice, and she saw herself. She placed a hand on Maya's shoulder and said very quietly, Don't, please don't. Whatever he did to you, it's not worth what it would do to you. He deserves it, Maya said, but her voice was wavering. Maybe he does, Jennifer acknowledged. But you don't deserve what would come after, trust me on this. And Maya, looking into the eyes of a woman who'd lived the consequences of her rage, decided to trust her. She dropped her keys into her pocket, and instead of going to destroy her boyfriend's car, she went to see a therapist. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't satisfying in the way that revenge would have been. But it meant that she didn't have to spend the next decade paying for a moment of rage. It meant that she got to keep the life she'd built. Jennifer left the classroom knowing that she'd helped one person avoid making her mistake. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could be redemption for what she'd done. But it was something. It was a way of transforming her suffering into purpose, her rage into wisdom, her worst moment into a lesson that could help others.